Last time we spoke about Operation Jinzhou and the defense of Harbin. In the tumultuous landscape of the early 1930s of China, Chiang Kai-shek hesitated to engage in combat, fearing internal factions and a looming threat of the CCP. Jang Shan, commanding a substantial force, felt pressure from both the Japanese and his own government. As tensions escalated, the Kwantung Army launched a brutal campaign against Jinzhou, leading to its fall. Amidst the chaos, resistance leaders like Jang Shan and Ding Zhao emerged, rallying against Japanese aggression, determined to protect their homeland despite limited support. In November, the Jilin provincial anti-Japanese government formed under Zhang Yun, rallying over 3,000 troops led by Feng Jianghai against the Japanese forces. After several battles, including the retaking of Shulan, they faced fierce resistance, but ultimately they had to retreat. As the Japanese advanced, the Jilin Self-Defense Army was established, but also after intense fighting, Harbin fell to the Japanese on February the 6th. Despite earlier victories, the Chinese resistance crumbled, leading to the establishment of Manchukuo and the end of organized resistance in Manchuria. This episode is, what was Manchukuo? Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I just released a 2-hour-long episode covering the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Also, if you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And I've got a very exciting podcast this month for the exclusive podcast series. After quite some time, I have finished the first episode in a new series, which is an alternate history of the Pacific War. The first episode is titled The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor, so please go check it out. To start off this rather unorthodox episode, I want to turn back to our old friend Ishiwata Kanchi. Ishiwata's ambition to dominate Manchuria was primarily a means to an end, to secure resources and a strategic position against the United States. After gaining control of Manchuria, Ishiwata shifted his focus towards another objective, fostering racial cooperation amongst the Asiatic peoples. His vision for Manchukuo, or rather his interpretation of it, served as a launching pad for another idea he had, the East Asian League, rooted firmly in the Final War theory. During this time in Manchuria, that is in 1932, this Pan-Asian concept of Manchukuo distinguished him from many of his colleagues in the Kwantung Army, and it marked him as a very unconventional man within the Imperial Japanese Army. As many of you know, Manchukuo was a fraudulent puppet state designed to legitimize Japan's takeover of Manchuria. The Japanese High Command aimed to disguise their literal invasion of this part of China as an indigenous independence movement. To achieve this, they installed Puyi, the last Qing emperor. He became the figurehead of Manchukuo while promoting ideals of racial harmony. This facade was necessary as controlling a population that harbored resentment towards them required some effort to win them favor. Fortunately for the Japanese, there were factions in Manchuria that actually desired independence. This region was the heartland of Nurhaci's Manchu people. Yes, that guy we spoke about all the way back in the beginning of this podcast series. The Japanese had considerable leverage, framing their actions as a noble revival of the Qing dynasty, or at least a restoration of the power of the Manchu. Additionally, there was a significant Mongolian presence, and Inner Mongolia would soon play a role in these events. Manchuria was reluctantly drawn into the nationalist movement, and it shared Japan's apprehension towards the USSR, having faced its own struggles against them for some time. Moreover, a large population of Japanese settlers in Manchuria welcomed the takeover, as the Jang Shan regime had not been particularly accommodating to them, implementing various discriminatory measures. Jang Shan's alliance with the nationalists effectively sealed the fate of the Japanese settlers, who anticipated expulsion. As military operations progressed, Ishiwara and Itagaki convened with other prominent Kwantung officers to strategize over how to control Manchuria. They met with Officer Katsukura, Chief of the Staff Miyake, and Tohara Kenji from the Mukden Special Service, reviewing a prior plan by Colonel Tohara for a multi-ethnic autonomous nation in Manchuria. This entity was to be led by Puyi, possessing complete autonomy in internal matters, while defense and foreign relations would be managed by the Japanese. Ishiwara drafted the plans by September the 22nd, which were sent to Tokyo on October the 2nd. Although Tokyo's high command disapproved of the objectives, they collaborated with the Kwantung Army for over 5 months to establish a new state based on two main principles: the purported indigenous movement for Manchurian Independence and the administrative framework for the Kwantung Army's control. The Kwantung Army proceeded to utilize Manchuria's traditional structure of local self-governing bodies. Throughout 1931, they bribed, persuaded, and threatened local leaders to foster a movement for autonomy against the Kuomintang hardliners. One of their first initiatives was to establish the Jechi Shidobu, Self-Government Guidance Board, responsible for coordinated regional independence movements in collaboration with the Kwantung Army, to, as Miyake put it, guide Manchuria to self-government. The board was headed by Yu Chenghan, a Mukden elder statesman educated in Japan and a former advisor to Jiang Zolin. It comprised 20 Japanese and 10 Manchurian members. Such organizations attracted Japanese civilians in Manchuria who supported the so-called multiracial political structure so that they could exploit it for their own interests. The Kwantung Army heavily promoted slogans like racial harmony, racial equality, and the righteous way. Their control over Manchuria was solidified by placing Japanese advisors in all governmental bodies, with the ultimate veto power, ensuring that everything was effectively under Japanese control. While it seemed that Ishiwara's vision was unfolding as planned, by 1933 he became a fierce critic of the very system he had helped establish. And I have to say, it's quite ironic that the man who played a key role in initiating the conquest of Manchuria would be unable to exert his influence in shaping Manchukuo. While Ishiwara Kanji served as the operations officer, officially responsible for planning and executing military operations to capture Manchuria, the political arrangements for the new state fell outside of his control. Nevertheless, Ishiwara was very vocal about his views on the development of Manchukuo, strongly advocating for racial harmony. He persistently urged his colleagues that the economic growth of Manchukuo should embody the spirit of racial cooperation. Ishiwara believed that the economic interest of Manchukuo would naturally align with those of the Kwantung Army, as both aimed for unity of Asia against the West. He was gravely mistaken. Ishiwara was driven by his theory of a final war, and everything he did was aimed at preparing for it. Thus, his fixation on racial harmony was part of this broader strategy. In March of 1932, the Self-Government Guidance Board was dissolved, transferring its functions and regional organizations to newly established boroughs within the Manchukuo government. In April, an organization called the Kowakai Concordia Association was formed, led by Yamaguchi Yuji and Ozawa Kaisaku, with the goal of promoting racial harmony. This initiative received support from members of the Kwantung Army, including Ishiwara, Itagaki, and Katsukura. The Kwantung Army invested heavily in the organization, which quickly gained traction, at least amongst the Japanese. General Honjo expressed concerns about the organization's potential political influence in Manchukuo, as he preferred it to remain an educational entity rather than evolve into an official political party. By educational role, he meant it should serve as a propaganda tool for the Kwantung Army, allowing them to exert further influence over Manchukuo without significant commitment. However, to Ishiwara, the Concordia Association was the logical means to unify the new nation, guiding its political destiny. To be blunt, Ishiwara really saw that it should have much more authority than his colleagues believed it should. Ishiwara complained in August of 1932 that Manchuria was a conglomerate of conflicting power centers such as the Kwantung Army, the new Manchukuo government, the Kwantung government, the Mansetsu, the consular office, and so on. Under so many different hats, he believed Manchukuo would never become a truly unified modern state, and of course, he was one of the few people that actually wanted it to be so. He began arguing that the Kwantung Army should turn over its political authority as soon as possible, so that, quote, Japanese of high resolve should hasten to the great work of the Manchurian Concordia Association, for I am sure that we Japanese will be its leaders. In this way, Manchukuo will not depend on political control from Japan, but will be an independent state based on Japanese-Manchurian cooperation. Guided by Japanese, it will be a mode of Sino-Japanese friendship, an indicator of the present trends of world civilization. Needless to say, the Concordia Association made little headway with the Chinese, and it began to really annoy Japanese leaders. The association gradually was bent into spiritless propaganda and the intelligence arm of the IGA, staffed largely by elite Japanese working in the Manchukuo government. Ishiwata started utilizing the Concordia Association to advocate for various causes, including the return of leased territories like the railway zone, the abolition of extraterritoriality, and equal pay for different races working in Manchukuo. All these efforts aimed at fostering racial harmony. However, this advocacy clashed significantly with the Japanese military's interests, damaging Ishiwata's reputation. As a result, the staff of the Kwantung Army began to shift dramatically, leaving Ishiwata increasingly isolated except for Itagaki and a few loyal supporters. The higher-ups had grown weary of the disruptive Concordia Association and gradually took control, ensuring that discussions about concessions were halted. In August of 1932, Ishiwata received a new assignment, and he appeared eager to leave Manchuria. I'm honestly brutally summarizing what was a complete episode I wrote in my Ishiwata series. The truth of it is Ishiwata really believed in the whole racial harmony thing, which I know sounds absolutely batshit crazy given what he had done. But he spiraled into a pit of depression over all of this, and he would go back home to Japan, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting Hideki Tojo. Honestly, it's an incredible story, and it's a very contradicting one. The man who fought so hard to invade Manchuria then would spend the rest of his life saying it was a mistake and that everybody screwed it up. But again, if you want to listen to those episodes, which used to be on the Patreon account, behind the paywall as they say, the Ishiwata series was so successful I eventually released it to the general public, so you can go over to the YouTube channel, the Pacific War channel, or Echoes of War on any podcast platform. You can find it there. It's a 4-part series. Now I want to get into more specifics as to what exactly this new state of Manchukuo was. During the mayhem that was the invasion of Manchuria, by October the 6th of 1931, a Japanese cabinet had finally relented and decided to no longer interfere with the establishment of the new regime in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. The remaining disagreement between the Japanese government, Tokyo General HQ, and the Kwantung Army was not whether or not to establish a new regime, but whether or not to promote the establishment of a new regime. Japan obviously did not want to break the Washington system established by the Treaty of Versailles, yet they of course wanted to expand Japanese interest in Manchuria. So it was to be a delicate game of chess, balancing their interests in coordination with the Western powers. This was specifically why Prime Minister Wakatsuki Reijiro had opposed direct participation of Japanese soldiers in the establishment of the new regime, because clearly it would open Japan to condemnation from the West. Of course, in the invasion, Japan managed to occupy the 3 northeastern provinces of Liaoning, Jilin, and Liujiang by establishing pro-Japanese regimes within each under Zhang, Shiyi, Xijia, and Jang, respectively. On September the 20th of 1931, Jang Shan proposed the establishment of a Japanese-backed regime led by Puyi during a meeting with Honjo Shigeru, the commander of the Kwantung Army. Obviously, Jang Shan was in league and under the influence of our old friend Tohara. 2 days later, September the 22nd, the Kwantung Army General Staff developed the solution to the Manchurian Mongolia issue based on Tohara's suggestion to create a 5-nation republic in Manchurian Mongolia, with Japan as its leader. The plan outlined the establishment of a new regime under Puyi, supported by Japan, to govern the 3 northeastern provinces and Inner Mongolia. The new regime would entrust Japan with national defense and diplomacy, as well as a management of key transportation and communication infrastructure. It also proposed appointing Xi Che, Zhang Haipeng, Tang Yulin, Yu Jishan, and Zhang Jinghui to oversee garrisons in locations such as Jilin, Taonan, Rehe, Dongbiandao, and Harbin. To execute this plan, the Kwantung Army, led by Chief of Staff Itagaki, utilized local intelligence agencies and some mainland ronin to initiate so-called strategic operations. To facilitate the plan's implementation, the Kwantung Army informed the commander of the Japanese army in Tianjin that very afternoon, requesting immediate protection for the Emperor Xuantong, that being the imperial name that Puyi took. After the Kwantung Army took control of Jinzhou, it believed the moment was right to establish the hastily assembled puppet regime. To secure the full backing of the Japanese government and the military leadership, the Kwantung Army decided to send Itagaki back to Tokyo for negotiations. At that time, Itagaki had a fairly detailed plan to present. The proposed Manchurian Mongolian central government aimed to create a centralized power structure that would be distinct from mainland China, effectively becoming a truly independent nation. They intended to appoint local collaborators as officials at all levels and were prepared to fabricate public opinion, to obscure global perceptions of Japan's scheme to establish this regime. This, of course, was highly influenced by the announcement from the League of Nations that they would be investigating the entire incident in what became known as the Lytton Commission. Thus, they believed it was essential to set up the regime before the League of Nations investigation team arrived in Manchuria. They understood that if these actions were carried out directly by Japan, they would violate both the Nine Power Treaty and the League of Nations. However, they reasoned that if the Chinese initiated the separation themselves, it would not contradict the principles of those treaties. The Kwantung Army established puppet organizations using collaborators, starting with the Liaoning Provincial Local Maintenance Association, which was formed on September the 25th of 1931. The association's chairman, Yuan Qinghai, represented the civil governance faction of the Fengtian clique. After the First Zhuli-Fengtian War, he had been appointed governor of Fengtian province by the Zhuli government, which obviously led to his unpopularity with Zhang Zuolin. At the time of the incident, he was already retired. The association's vice chairman, Kan Chaoxi, had previously served as the governor of Rehe and the commander of the 3rd Division. He fell out of favor with Zhang Zuolin due to his involvement with Guo Songling, that guy who made that crazy rebellion, and he also subsequently retired. A common characteristic of the puppet organizations created by the Kwantung Army is that they always included Japanese advisors, regardless of their level. The Liaoning Provincial Local Maintenance Association was no exception. They hired Kanai Shoji, head of the health section of the local department of the Manchurian Railway, and the chairman of the Manchurian Youth League, as their top advisor. In Japanese-occupied Fengtian, the highest advisor effectively became the leader of the Maintenance Association. While the association was responsible for maintaining local order, it actually functioned as a tool for Japan to establish a puppet regime. Recruiting discontented officials and creating puppet institutions was just a minor part of the Kwantung Army's strategy to set up the puppet regime. The crucial factor in this endeavor was gaining the support of influential local warlords. To achieve this, the Kwantung Army, along with various intelligence agencies, employed a mix of soft and hard tactics, including coercion and incentives, the age-old carrot and sticks. As a result, they successfully pressured figures like Yu Shan, Zhang Haipeng, Zhang Jinghui, Xi Jia, Xiang Shiyi, and Ma Zhishan to defect to the Japanese. Following the Mukden incident, former Qing nobles who had hoped to restore the Qing dynasty believed that the moment had arrived. Xi Jia, a member of the former Qing royal family and the chief of staff of the Jilin Provincial Army at the time, took advantage of Jilin's governor's absence due to his mother's funeral to open the gates of Jilin and surrender to the Japanese. This made Xi Jia the first Chinese official to collaborate with the Japanese invaders since their invasion of China. He sent a secret letter to the abdicated Qing Emperor Puyi, urging him to return to the, quote, birthplace of the ancestors and restore the Qing dynasty, rescue the people from their suffering. And we could do so, with the backing of friendly nations. Xi Jia and the former Manchu nobles, who had elevated him to acting governor of Jilin province, proposed to the Japanese to invite Puyi to the northeast to establish a monarchy. The Kwantung Army had already identified Puyi as a suitable puppet leader. After the 15-year war had concluded, under interrogation, Shirano Hiroshi confessed that the reason why the Japanese had chosen Puyi was, quote, first, Puyi had no connection with the Kuomintang in mainland China. Second, some old classes in the northeast and Mongolia still have traditional yearnings for the Qing dynasty. Third, The peasants in general seemed to welcome the kingly political system implemented by the Aisingyoro family. On November the 8th of 1931, Tohara orchestrated the Tianjin incident, and he covertly removed Puyi from his home in the Japanese concession in Tianjin. They traveled through Daguko, Yinko, and Lushun before arriving in Fushun. By February the 5th of 1932, the Japanese army had taken control of Harbin, stabilizing the situation in North Manchuria. Afterwards, the Kwantung Army headquarters organized a series of National Construction Staff meetings to plan for a National Construction Conference involving the collaborators. On the 16th of February, leaders from the northeastern provinces, including Jang Shan, Xi Jia, Ma Shan, Xiang Shiyi, Xi Zhuxi, Yu Zhonghan, Zhao Xingbo, and Yun Chikai, gathered for the Northeast Political Affairs Conference at the Yamato Hotel in Shenyang. The meeting was led by Honjo Shigeru, the commander of the Kwantung Army. They decided to invite Puyi to rule the puppet state of Manchukuo, and they assigned government positions to all of the attendees. Notably, Itagaki Seisashiro was appointed as the head of the Fangxian Special Agency and the chief advisor to the military and political department of Manchukuo. Now, on February 18th, the Northeast Administrative Committee issued a Declaration of Independence stating this: "From now on, we declare that the regions of Manchuria and Inner Mongolia will be separated from the Chinese central government, based on the free choice and appeal of the residents of Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. These regions will achieve complete independence and establish a fully independent government." On February the 23rd, Itagaki met with Puyi in Fushun to inform him that he would be the ruler of Manchuria. Although Puyi had hoped to reclaim the throne, he was disappointed by the term ruler, but he felt compelled to accept it. On the 29th, the All-Manchurian National Construction Promotion Movement Conference passed their resolution urging Puyi to take the role of the ruler. The Japanese army began its offensive against Ruhe. Meanwhile, the League of Nations declared it would not recognize this new state of Manchukuo. On March the 1st, Japan orchestrated the establishment of Manchukuo, appointing Puyi as its ruler under the reign title of Daotong. China firmly rejected the notion of Manchukuo's independence and lodged a strong protest against Japan on the same day. On March the 8th, Puyi officially declared his inauguration as the ruler of Manchukuo in Qing. Concurrently, officials were appointed to various offices, ministerial positions, and ministries, leading to the formal establishment of the puppet state. The following day, Puyi conducted an inauguration ceremony, and on March the 10th, a secret agreement was signed with Japan. Japanese ambassador to Manchuria, Nobuyushi Muto, and Prime Minister Zhong Xiaoshu signed the Japan-Manchuria Agreement in Changchun, with the Japanese government issuing a statement recognizing Manchukuo. In October of 1932, the League of Nations Assembly released the Lin Commission report. Alarmed by the Mukden incident, the League of Nations had dispatched a group of investigators, led by the British statesman Lord Lytton, to uncover the truth of what was going on. The commission traveled to Manchuria, gathering testimonies and examining evidence. Their task was daunting. Japan insisted its actions were defensive, protecting its economic interests and citizens. Meanwhile, China accused Japan of orchestrating the railway incident as an excuse for the invasion. Months later, the Lytton report emerged, painting a pretty balanced yet damning picture. On February the 24th, the commission concluded that the Mukden incident was staged by Japanese troops. It condemned Japan's actions as a violation of Chinese sovereignty, rejecting their claims of self-defense. Moreover, the report did not recognize the puppet state of Manchukuo, established by Japan in Manchuria. Instead, it called for Manchuria's return to China, with a further arrangement respecting the regional autonomy. Though praised for its fairness, the report lacked any teeth. Later on, the League urged Japan to withdraw, but Japan walked out of the League of Nations instead, solidifying its grip on Manchuria. Manchukuo's territory would span the former provinces of Liaoning, Jilin, and Heilongjiang province, including the Kwangtung territory as well. It would also gradually incorporate eastern parts of Inner Mongolia, Chengdu City, and Ruhe province. The 1932 Japan-Manchuria Protocol established that the sovereignty of the Kwangtung territory belonged to Manchukuo. This entity acknowledged the Qing dynasty's agreement to lease the Guangdong territory, which includes Lushun and Dalian. As a result, the Guangdong territory remained under direct Japanese control and was not included in the administrative division of Manchukuo. By 1934, Manchukuo was divided into 14 provinces, 2 special cities, and 1 special district. Andong Province, Fengtian Province, Jinzhou, Jianyan, Ruhe, Jinjiao, Huhe, Sanjiang, Longjiang, Binjiang, Xinjiang East, Xinjiang West, Xinjiang South, Xinjiang North, Xinjiang, Harbin, Special City, and North Manchurian Special District. By 1939, this would increase to 19 provinces and 1 special city. Politically, Puyi served as the nominal head of the state. He took on the role of ruler on March 8th, adopting the reign title of Datong. On March 1st of 1934, Puyi conducted a coronation ceremony in Xinhua village, located south of Xinjiang, and this renamed Manchukuo to the Great Manchurian Empire. In this capacity, Puyi was designated as the emperor with the reign title of Kangde. Manchukuo's administrative structure was led by the State Council, headed by the Premier. This pseudo-State Council included the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Civil Affairs, of Finance, of Justice, of Industry, of Transportation, of Culture and Education, and of Military Affairs. The Ministry of Finance was later renamed the Ministry of Economy, while the Ministry of Military Affairs retained its name. The Ministry of Industry was split into the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Labor, and additional departments like the Ministry of Health and Warfare were established. Each ministry was led by a minister, but real power rested with the Japanese vice ministers. The head of the General Affairs Department of the State Council, who was also Japanese, effectively served as the premier. This role was first held by Komai Tokusu, followed by Hoshino Naki, and then Takebe Rokizo. Every Tuesday, the Japanese vice ministers convened to discuss and make decisions on national policies and various specific matters in a meeting known as the Fire Tuesday meeting. The Legislative Assembly of Manchukuo was known as the Legislative Yuan, with Zhao Xingpo serving as its first president. However, true legislative authority rested with the Kwantung Army. Manchukuo operated without a formal constitution, instead relying on a series of special laws. The advisory group was referred to as the Senate, led by a speaker, with Zhang Qiyi being the inaugural holder of that position. The highest judicial authority in the puppet of Manchukuo was the Supreme Court, with Lin Qi as the first Supreme Justice, and Li Pan serving as the Supreme Prosecutor General. The judicial agency was the Imperial Household Agency, held by Xi Jia. Following the September 18th incident, Jiang Shan maintained a policy of non-resistance. Most of the former Northeastern Army was ordered to retreat south of Shananguan, without engaging in any combat. Those who could not withdraw were split into 2 factions. One group, motivated by national integrity and a shared animosity towards the enemy, rose to fight against Japan, and they would become a significant part of the renowned Northeast Volunteer Army. The other faction consisted of traitors who surrendered, acknowledged the enemy as their leader, and acted as enforcers and thugs for the Japanese. These collaborators and forces they commanded formed the backbone of the puppet Manchukuo Army. Simultaneously, they recruited defectors and traitors as well as bandits and social miscreants, thereby bolstering the ranks of the puppet Manchukuo military. They were under the influence of the highest advisors from the puppet Manchukuo military and political department, which were made up of Japanese military officials. Directly controlled by the Kwantung Army, they served as vassals and accomplices of Japanese imperialism. The State Council of Manchukuo served as the governing body of the puppet state. It functioned as the highest political authority in the region. Structurally, it operated under the direct control of the head of state, Puyi. However, in practice, the State Council was heavily influenced by the Japanese Kwantung Army, with many key positions occupied by Japanese officials. The breakdown of power is as follows. At the top, as the head of state, was the emperor. Below him was the emperor's direct agencies, that of the Imperial Household Agency, Shangshifu, the Senate, Military Attaché's Office, Military Advisory Council, and the Sacrifice Office. Under them was the Yuan State Council, the courts, the Legislative Yuan, and the Control Yuan. Under them was the National Army, the Royal Guards, the River Defense Fleet, the Flying Squadron, Xing'an Army, and the Jinjiao Special Forces. Below them was the police, the Maritime Police Forces, and the Security Bureau, and lastly there was other agencies such as the General Affairs Department. To fulfill its goal of annexing northeast China, Japan initiated a national policy immigration campaign under the guise of development, intending to relocate 1 million households of 5 million Japanese citizens from Japan to northeastern China over 2 decades. Additionally, around 2 million Koreans were moved to the region as political immigrants. In April of 1936, the Kwantung Army convened an immigration meeting in Changchun, where they developed the Manchuria Agricultural Immigration Million Households Migration Plan. By September of 1944, there were 1.6 million Japanese immigrants, residing in various areas of northeast China. Following 1945, most Japanese immigrants were repatriated, notably during the large-scale repatriation in Huludao, although the issue of Japanese orphans was quite large. Following the Mukden incident, in response to the invasion of the Japanese, people of all nationalities and professions in China tried to resist them fiercely. The Japanese employed military forces, police, and special repressive agencies to brutally suppress the anti-Japanese movement, inflicting significant suffering on the Chinese populace. In addition to collaborating with the Kwantung Army for extensive military encirclement and suppression, the Kwantung Military Police Force oversaw other repressive agencies during the peacetime and became the primary force behind the implementation of a White Terror. As for its economy, Manchukuo was rich in natural resources. By 1936, its coal reserves were about 3 billion tons, iron reserves roughly 4 billion, and had other minerals including gold, magnesite, bauxite, oil shale, diamonds. Its forestry and fishery industry was also quite rich as well. During the Jang Shan era, Manchuria's industrial base was already well developed, and Japan required a robust military industry to support its aggressive war efforts. Steel production was primarily located in Nanshan and Benxi, while the chemical industry was centered around Liaoyang. The coal industry was concentrated in Fushun, Benxi, and Fuxin. Oil shale and synthetic fuel production were mainly found in Fuxin and Jilin. Magnesite mining took place in Haicheng and Daoxiqiao, and hydropower generation was focused in Jilin along the Yalu River. Fengtian, now Shenyang, served as the hub for machinery, arms, and aircraft industries, whereas light industries, including textiles and food production, were centered around cities like Dalian, Dandong, Harbin, and Qiqihar. The industrial sector of the puppet state was largely controlled by the South Manchurian Railway Company. Following the establishment of the puppet state, investments from various Japanese conglomerates rapidly flowed into northeastern China, these being, of course, the infamous Aibatsu. After 1937, the puppet state implemented an economic control policy for the industrial sector, adhering to the principle of one industry, one company, which led to the creation of monopoly companies for each industry. Under this framework, the South Manchurian Railway transferred its industrial operations and reorganized them into a massive conglomerate called the Manchuria Heavy Industry Development Corporation, which monopolized all steel, coal, chemical, and electrical power industries in the region. Additionally, over 40 specialized companies were established, including the Manchuria Electric, Telephone Telegraph Company, Manchuria Machinery Manufacturing Company, Manchuria Mining Company, Manchuria Airlines, Manchuria Artificial Oil, Textile Company, Wool Textile Company, and so on and so forth. All of these companies were jointly established by Japanese investors and the Manchukuo government, with profits shared accordingly to their respective investments. In case of losses, the Manchu government guaranteed about 10% of the profits for Japanese investments. To transform Manchuria into a base for its aggressive expansion against China and the Pacific War, Japan imposed strict control and extensive exploitation of the region's economy and resources. The primary focus of this control and exploitation was on mineral resources such as coal, iron, and oil, as well as essential industries. Under the intense plundering and strict oversight of Japanese imperialism, northeastern China's economy rapidly became colonial, leading to severe hardships for its people. Due to Japan's stringent economic control policies and large-scale colonial exploitation, the local industry and mining sectors suffered. National industries declined, and the rural economy collapsed, resulting in a swift transformation of northeastern China into a real colony. To maximize the extraction of colonial resources, the Japanese invaders minimized the consumption levels of the local population. Since 1935, they implemented comprehensive distribution controls on vital strategic materials and everyday necessities. This distribution control policy plunged the people of northeastern China into extreme poverty and suffering. In 1936, resource survey reports from the State Council indicated that the region had an arable land area of about 40 million hectares, that's the equivalent of 4 billion mu, with 25 million hectares classified as cultivated land. Additionally, the forested area covered about 170 million hectares. The annual production figure included 2.5 million tons of soybeans, 2 million tons of wheat, 700,000 tons of rice, 1 million tons of millet, 8 million tons of sorghum, 5 million tons of corn, 600,000 tons of other grains and beans, including soybeans, 300,000 tons of cotton, and 160,000 tons of tobacco. The livestock population consisted of 4 million horses, 3 million cattle, 30 million sheep, and 40 million pigs. The total annual grain output in Manchukuo was approximately 20 million tons. Of this, around 7.5 million tons was consumable grains for the local farmers throughout the year, while 4 million tons were designated as seed grains. Furthermore, the region was responsible for supplying rations to Japanese and Korean immigrants. In compliance with the demands of the Kwantung Army, the puppet Manchukuo was obligated to deliver 1 million tons of grain to Japan annually. The grain collection process commenced in mid-August and concluded at the end of November, imposing a significant burden on the farmers. Japanese colonists were exempt from agricultural taxes and received monthly rations. Manchukuo had a military force known as the Manchukuo Army. It was divided into 3 components: rear security, law, and order maintenance, all under the control of the Kwantung Army. Initially, its military capabilities were quite limited, with the Kwantung Army handling most combat operations. However, as the main forces of the Kwantung Army shifted south and manpower became scarce, the anti-Japanese armed groups in northeastern China were suppressed and weakened. Consequently, Manchukuo began to assume more military responsibilities on its own, with many of its soldiers being Korean. These were recruited, of course, from the Korean peninsula by the Japanese. The entire northeast was segmented into 11 military-controlled zones, each led by an individual known as a commander. The military authority of the puppet state was under the control of the Kwantung Army. Any troop movements, training exercises, equipment modifications, or personnel changes required approval from the Kwantung Army headquarters. Within the Manchukuo Army, there was 9 ranks: general, colonel, lieutenant, and so forth. Upon graduating from the military academies, individuals were promoted to second lieutenant. After 2 years, they advanced to first lieutenant, and then to captain after another 3 years. Following that, a captain would be promoted to a major, and after that to a lieutenant colonel, and then a lieutenant colonel would become a colonel, and then he would be promoted to major general after another 4 years. After additional 3 years, a major general could rise to the rank of lieutenant general, and finally, after another 4 years, lieutenant general could achieve the rank of general. The highest military rank, of course, was general, like any other military, which would be a lifetime appointment. Above the rank of general was the honorary title modeled after the Japanese marshal. Individuals such as Zhang Jinghui, Zhang Haipeng, Yu Shan, and Ji Xing were conferred the title of general. And thus was born the state that would contribute to the 15-year war in Asia. This is Manchukuo. I would like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a long-form documentary covering the war for Manchuria. That is, it covers the Boxer Rebellion and the Russo-Japanese War. And over on Echoes of War, we just released an episode covering the Revolt of Boudica. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and of course, voting rights for the subjects Yes, I will admit perhaps this episode was a bit on the boring side of things, but it is important to take a critical look into what exactly Manchukuo was. The new puppet state would be used for various means during the 15-year war, and would ultimately be the crown jewel in a long list of conquered territories by the Japanese Empire.